The Black women's feminist movement dates back to the African continent. We just call it feminism. We have always, as Black women, stood up for our rights wherever we were, even pre-colonization.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Rebay. Welcome to the Contrary. This week, we continue our series of interviews with women thought leaders. Our guest is Farah Tanis. She heads the Black Women's Blueprint, an organization that focuses on the empowerment of Black women and girls. Welcome to the show, Farah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell me about the Black Women's Blueprint. You founded it. What's the mission?
The Black Women's Blueprint, our mission is to create opportunities for Black women and girls to become empowered, for Black women and girls to engage in community organizing, to erase disparities around gender, around health, around sexual assault, and other disparities that critically impact the lives, the well-being, the economic well-being in particular of Black women and girls.
How long do you think it will take for Black women and girls to be as fully empowered as white men?
I think that's an interesting question. I think that, when someone says, how long is it going to take? I forgot who said it, but someone once said, well, I know for me, I have at my age, I say maybe I have another 60, 70 years to give to this movement. And if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. And what we have to do is we have to make sure that we embolden the next generation, to be able to continue the work. So I'm not quite sure how long it takes, but I know day by day, I can see the difference and I can see the progress and I can see how women are being empowered day by day.
What does the presidential administration have to do with empowerment of Black women and girls?
I think that there is a decreased sense of hope. I think that we are keeping our chins up, and I think that we are there's the fiercest resolve as a result of this administration. So in that sense, okay, we're keeping our chins up and there's fierce resolve, and we are committed to protesting. We are even more committed to creating, the world we want to see, the communities we want to see, the families we want to see. However, it is a struggle. It's a struggle because every time we think we are making headway, every time we think that there might be the possibility of equity, something happens, news breaks, a tweet goes out, and here we are back in the same place. And it's a reminder that we're really living in this type of environment where everything seems surreal. Nothing makes any sense anymore. The most egregious behavior, the most egregious comments and commentary, opinions, the expressions of our president, the president, reminds us that we are not living in the same world we were living in 8 years ago, or even, 20 years ago, that things are becoming more and more difficult. And it's almost like pushing a boulder up a mountain. And we're waiting to see when do we get to the top of that mountain where we no longer have to exert so much energy.
You say that women, children, families who are on federal benefits are pulling back from them. Tell me about that.
Well, the way that works is that it works especially in cases of immigrant families and immigrant mothers who may or may not be documented. And because of the attacks on immigrants in this country, which I don't think is going away anytime soon, a lot of families have opted out of receiving aid, even if it's aid to a child who is documented and who is entitled to that aid in this country. And so, your food stamps, your whatever subsidy you get for housing. And so they're opting out because it's safer. They feel safer. They feel safer to be under the radar. They feel safer to pretty much go underground. And so what's happening in our communities is now we, as Black women, as women in New York City, as women everywhere. I think there's a movement around solidarity economy that has begun. Actually, I can't even say that it has begun because it's been happening for so long. And in fact, it's a tradition and it's a practice that has been in existence in our communities as Black people post-slavery, post-emancipation, during the Jim Crow era, where it was difficult for some of us to find jobs unless it was domestic work or another type of work. It's also something that is very popular in certain parts of Africa, also throughout the Caribbean. We pull our resources together. And so one community at a time, it may even be something as small as a church or another form of an institution. We pull our resources together, whether that be our monies, whether that be our food, whether that be childcare, whether that be housing, and we share it. And so there's bartering that goes, that's a process of that. We do it through bartering. We have a gift economy. We have clothing swaps. We have time banking. And so we exchange time. I will give you 4 hours of childcare. You will give me 4 hours of maybe cleaning, or if you have another skill like grant writing or, anything else, or gardening, you will give me that. If I grow vegetables in my backyard, I will exchange that for perhaps a new pair of shoes.
You refer to yourself as a transnational feminist. What's the difference between that and what most people think of as feminism?
Well, I think that differs in the sense that we bring in, as transnational feminists, that we bring in and we give very great consideration to geography, and we give great consideration to nation and to, where it is that we are from and how we are positioned in relationship to other nations. And so, for example, I was born in Haiti. I grew up here in this country, but I was born in Haiti. And so the way that my country is impacted by the U.S. government is something that I integrate in all of my work, that I integrate in all of my conversations, and in any agenda that I develop with U.S.-based feminism, with U.S.-based feminists. And so one of the demands that we make is that we ask U.S.-based feminists to not only think about how the administration is impacting any administration, in fact, any U.S. policy is impacting what's going on in this country, but how in turn their support or their silence around it can also impact what happens in other countries.
There was talk that Black women were left out of second wave feminism by white women. Does it still feel that way? And what is your organization doing to change that?
I think that, I didn't start the Black women's feminist movement. That's one. I think that the Black women's feminist movement dates back to the African continent. We just call it feminism, and it's sort of, the word has become stigmatized. But, I think we have always, as Black women, stood up for our rights wherever we were, even pre-colonization. But in terms of just this contemporary time and really leading a faction, I guess, of the feminist movement. We have feminists in reproductive rights. We have feminists in various areas. I think in that sense, there is something very specific that I am, here to do in this day and in this time. We have felt, you're right, we have felt that white feminists left us out of the conversation and left us out of the agenda.
Do you think you might marginalize Black women and girls in any way by having a Black Women's March?
We don't fear marginalization. It's not something that's new. I think that whether or not there was a Black Women's Blueprint, that we would be marginalized anyway. Marginalization is something that we've had to deal with the first National Black Feminist Organization back in 1972. Marginalization is something that Sojourner Truth addressed when she said, "Ain't I a woman?" in her speech. Ida B. Wells has had to address marginalization. Fannie Lou Hamer with voting rights. Pat Parker with the welfare rights movement. We've all had to face marginalization. If we were to keep thinking about whether or not if we started something for ourselves that we would be marginalized, I think that we would never start anything at all.
You started the Black Women's March, which took place last fall. How did it go, and what did it mean to you personally to be behind that event?
Well, I think that the March for Black Women was just a tremendous opportunity for Black women to come together across diversity. And as we just spoke about our relationship with white women and white feminists, it was also a tremendous opportunity for white feminists to come together and to support Black women, for other women of color to come together and support Black women, and for Black men to come together and support Black women. And so it was, what was amazing about that march was just when you looked out into the sea of faces, you saw everyone represented. And I think that form of affirmation and that form of just that acknowledgement that there is a reason for Black women to have a march, and that we do have issues that are very similar to other women, but also very unique and very different, that there are intersectionalities that we need to highlight when we talk about our needs and our policies and what happens in our communities. And so it was a tremendous, more than just a moment. It really functioned as another springboard for us to think about what happens next politically in our country and how we can take back control. You know, we've been we're a huge voting bloc, you know, everywhere. And so I think that there's some hope that came out of that for Black women.
How are you incorporating the experiences of Black women and transnational feminists in your organization? How does that work?
One of the ways that we're incorporating that is by uplifting and highlighting what is happening in other countries and how, for example, especially countries where agriculturally women are engaged in farming, or there's a high rate of trafficking, human trafficking and sex trafficking, and forced prostitution, for example, in parts of Brazil, throughout the Caribbean, again, with natural disasters, how we should, that should be part of what we discuss when we think about the impact of oppressive systems and structures, how women are starving. When we think about reproductive justice and reproductive health care, we incorporate the needs of women in developing countries, the needs of women in countries in Africa, and the needs of women not throughout the global South, you know, and what's happening with our girls as well. The need for education. Those are the things that we talk about, and that's how we incorporate the issues.
And you also represent the Black LGBTQ community, right?
You know, and that's another thing. I think what's wonderful about the concept and this notion of intersectionality is that we can look at race, class, gender, nation, immigration status. We can look at sexuality and gender identity. And so there were four of us, or four organizations who participated in doing this. Although I was the lead organizer, I brought on the Black Youth Project, located out of Chicago, with several chapters throughout the nation, including here. I included Sister Song, which focuses on reproductive justice and Black women in particular. I included Trans Sisters of Color Detroit, which focuses on the trans community, trans-identified women's health, trans-identified women's safety, and really the right to not be murdered.
Do you know how many women of color and African American women are not registered to vote?
I don't have the exact number, but my sense is, and in our conversations around voting, I would say about half of us are not registered to vote. I think a lot of the elders are registered to vote, but then, you know, with voter suppression and knowing what Black women and Black folks have had to go through just to get to the polls, once you start implementing or imposing rules around IDs and, you know, lack of access to transportation, long lines, I think that discourages people from voting.
Is part of your training teaching women of color how to use absentee and mail-in ballots?
That is one thing that we are working with Higher Heights, who is not only helping women to register to vote as a fellow, as a sister feminist organization, Black feminist organization in Brooklyn, but doing the work nationally. Higher Heights is registering women to vote and is really helping women to understand how you can vote even if you can't show up, even if you're elsewhere. And they're also teaching Black women how to run for office, how to really understand, the electoral process, whether it's at the local level or at the national and federal level.
Do you expect to see a lot of Black women and other women of color winning in 2018?
I think even with this last election, there were several African American women or actually women of color in general, right, who were able to take office. There are several more African American women and women of color who are running for office in their local elections. Even if it's running for your PTA, for your community board, I think that we're encouraging women of color to really take the charge and take that bold step to think about running for office and to take leadership, even at those levels.
Do African American women face bigger burdens when they run for office? And how does their self-esteem play into that?
I think when it comes to running for office for African American women, the issues are more structural and systemic and societal rather than personal, right? So personally, there's the issue of self-esteem. That would be a personal barrier to running for office. So, several women have self-esteem issues, regardless of race, regardless of, ethnicity, but they can still run for office, right? White women in particular can run for office because, you have to raise funds. And there's more access to funds, there's more access to funding, there's more access to resources to be able to do that. With Black women, there's less access. And so you have organizations like Demos, and you have organizations like Higher Heights again, and several others who are really helping to raise money to back African American women and women of color in general to run for office, people of color to run for office, with all that they will need, with all of the training, with all of the technical assistance, with all of the teams. They equip them with all of the teams that they would need, and also the fundraising assistance that they would need, because the access is different.
Which is worse, sexism or racism?
I think for Black women, I think most of us would answer that you can't really separate the two. Sexism and racism is something that we're impacted by every single day. Sexism and racism shows up in our lives in both the private and the public sphere. It shows up in the education system. It shows up on the street, and it shows up in our homes. It shows up in our relationships. And I'm talking about both sexism and racism, what's internalized and what is coming from the outside world. And so it's something, it's really not a question for us as to whether one is worse than the other. And there are a lot of debates internally about, sexism and racism, which came first, the chicken or the egg. I think within the context of the United States, it would be a different response than if you went anywhere else, in the world. For example, if you went on the African continent, they would talk to you about, well, there were different levels of patriarchy that existed. And then there were also societies that were very matriarchal or matrilineal, which existed. But the issue of racism came about, and racialization came about, around the 1400s.
Did President Trump's election help you fundraise, as, for example, it did other nonprofits like the ACLU?
Right. Well, that's the ACLU, right? So that's a mainstream organization. I think since the Trump administration, organizations that are led by people of color have not seen an increase in funding. I think, that also speaks to, the new era that we're living in. Trump was elected, really, racism had a lot to do with it. Trump was elected because people were thinking about making America great again. The issues that we address have never been issues that were popular, have never been sexy issues. The issues that we address are around sexual assault. The issues that we address are around personal safety, state violence, mass incarceration. And we do it in such a way that we're dealing in many, many ways, one-on-one with people around the issue of healing. We're dealing with communities around healing and around really empowering the community internally.
Changes in Title IX, how are they going to affect Black women on campus?
That is going to be devastating. The guidance issued by the Obama administration were helpful. They ensured certain rights for survivors of sexual assault. They also ensured rights for the accused already. It was already there. But they also ensured rights for and ways in which that cases of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual discrimination could be handled from K to 12. Now we're seeing something completely different. We're seeing these very protections just disappear and eroded, and we're not sure what else is going to come out of this.
Are there still a lot of Black women on campus not reporting sexual assault?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, because of the legacy of racism, a legacy that has especially targeted men around the issue of sexual assault and around lynching because of rape. I mean, the main reason, if you look at our history, that a Black man was lynched was either for attempting, supposedly, being accused of raping a white woman, looking at a white woman, whistling at a white woman. We can think of Emmett Till, or attempting to vote, right? Those are some of the reasons, or having a successful business, daring to have a successful business. And so I think that for us has implanted in our minds this sense of racial loyalty and to really protect our brothers, our fathers, our sons. And so, it's one issue that, that you have to look at from a historical context. And so now it makes it even more difficult, right? So those are historical facts and historical narratives that have passed, we've passed on from generation to generation. And so it makes it more and more difficult to report to the police or report an offense, a sexual assault against us. We don't want to see another brother put in prison or in jail. And many times that means we sacrifice ourselves.
Do you think white women with sons have any idea of how much more difficult it is for Black mothers of sons to raise their children?
I don't think they have any idea. I don't think they have any idea what it's like to raise a Black son or to raise a Black daughter. I think raising a Black daughter also carries a great responsibility in the sense that we, even as Black daughters, even as little girls, we know that it's our role to protect our community, and it's our role to protect even our big brothers from the police. And the one thing that we do at Black Women's Blueprint, when we talk about there is no racial justice without gender justice, is that we're saying that how can we fight for racial justice for only one segment of the population? How can we not look at the plight of trans women, trans-identified women, which is that's gender issues? How can we not look at our girls disappearing from the streets of even Washington, D.C.? How can we not look at the fact that Black women earn even less when working than Black men do? How can we not look at that Black women make up almost half of intimate partner homicides at the hands of our own brothers? And so when you think about that, and that's not even going back historically, the fact that Black women birth whole generations of more enslaved people for a country that, that thrived. They thrived. This country thrived off of our very bodies and our abilities to birth entire generations of enslaved people. And so that is gender justice. The act of having to birth a whole generation. That is definitely that's racial justice, and that is gender justice combined, which is why we can't really separate the two. And so, no, I don't think that white mothers can understand what it's like to raise a Black son or a Black daughter and what weight that carries, not only through the lens of contemporary issues, but our history is ever present. The memory is ever present.
Thank you so much. And what a note to go out on. You certainly have a lot of work left to do. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/To the Contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.